And that's the end of the first half. As the teams head to the locker room, the Spartans lead the Bulldogs by a score.
You guys stink.
Geez, Coach, we're only down a couple of points.
No, I mean you guys really smell. You need to hit the showers. And here, I got every one of you new bars of soap from the Sterling Soap Company. Each bar is artisan crafted using natural ingredients and essential oils. They also have shave soaps, colognes, beard balm, and a whole lot more. Now get in there.
But Coach, we have another half to play.
I don't care. I can't stand to be around you.
A few minutes later.
All right, bring it in tight. You guys are still playing terrible, but you're smelling great out there. Now listen, you're going to need to stock up for the rest of the season. We got a lot of tough games left. So go to sterlingsoap.com after the game. That's STIRLING soap.com. You got that?
Yes, Coach.
Great. Sterlingsoap.com on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
All right, so moving right along, we are going to talk about Ryne Sandberg, who was born in 1959 and died on July 28th. One of the most beloved players in Chicago Cubs history, Sandberg won 9 straight Gold Gloves and made 10 consecutive All-Star teams. Elected to the Hall of Fame in 2005, he is one of the greatest players never to play in a World Series. We are glad to have back with us yet another guest, or actually plural, guests from the Historically Speaking Sports podcast. You heard them right at the outset talking about Gus Williams, and now they're here to talk about a different sport and a different guy in a different city. Chuck Combs, Dana Auguster, thanks so much for joining us to talk about Ryne Sandberg. And Dana has been with us a lot of years in the past. This is Chuck's first time, but I guess I'm curious, Dana. I think this is the first baseball player that you've ever done with me, and then
yes.
You tend to sort of, like everybody that does this, kind of focus more on certain teams, certain cities, and I was a little surprised about you doing Sandberg. So what was it about Ryne Sandberg that made you guys want to come on and talk about him?
Well, it wasn't necessarily me.
Okay. Fair enough.
Okay, it wasn't necessarily me. I've enjoyed watching Sandberg, over the years, and I've learned a lot about him. But the reason why I picked Sandberg was because of my co-host. Chuck is a huge, huge Chicago Cubs fan. Mm-hmm. And he would tell me all the time that he and Ryne Sandberg had a standing date every day on WGN in Chicago when he would come home and watch the Cubs after school. And so I picked Ryne Sandberg specifically for him to have him discuss it. So, Chuck, you've told me so much about Ryne Sandberg when we were, since we've been friends. He's one of your all-time favorite players, so have at it. When you think of Ryne Sandberg, what made him such of a big fan of yours? Or were you a fan of his?
Well, Ryne Sandberg is always, I refer to him as my third big brother pretty much. Because, coming up as a kid in the 80s, my 2 older brothers, one is 5 years older than me, the other 3. And then, at that age, your big brothers don't want to hang out with your little brother. So I had big brothers in theory, but in day-to-day, interaction, absolutely not. So that's what Ryne Sandberg came in. And then, as you know, Dana, when in the 80s, this is before the ESPN national coverage where you could see every game. The only thing that we had on a national level would be the Saturday afternoon game of the month, game of the week on NBC with Ben Scully and Joe Garagiola. That was it for national coverage. So pretty much the only choices you had if you were a baseball fan, you either had the Cubs on WGN or you had to settle for the Braves on WTBS at the time. So because of Harry Carey and how he would carry on like he was in the bar room, he and Steve Stone, I gravitated to the Cubs in the first season that I started watching them was the 1984 season. As you know, they won the National League East and wound up in the LCS against the Padres, jumped out 2-0, thought they were going to finally make the World Series for the first time since '46. But then Steve Garvey hit a walk-off in game 4, and then we had Rick Sutcliffe going, and Leon Durham let the ball go through his legs. We lost game 5-2. So that was that. And Ryne Sandberg was gravitated. He was just a great player. He made the routine just look easy. Like on the 6-4-3 double play, he would just turn his back to that runner coming from first and fire that peg over, because, most guys, they bail out of there. He would always stand in there and make a strong throw. Then he was the prototypical number 2 hitter, excellent speed, could hit the off fields, could go the other way, had good power, had great speed as well. And then I just love the way he carried himself, because he always, the Cubs had some awful teams in the 80s, but he would go out there in the daytime and just play his heart out. They could be, because usually by mid-June, the season is over with. They're already 20 games behind the Mets, who were in the East 2 at the time. But you wouldn't know it by the way that he played today. And he means a lot for me from a personal standpoint, because as Dana alluded to, the personal date, I would get out of school at 2:15 in middle school every day, and the Cubs would come on WGN at 1:20, and I would jump on the bus, rush in a hurry up and get home so I could watch the Cub game, or hopefully they're in the 4th inning, watch them. Then through middle school, watch Thundercats, He-Man, Transformers, all of that. Then when I got a little bit older, it would be the Cubs, but then the cartoons got replaced by Rap City and Yo MTV Raps. So
yeah,
as I mentioned, Ryne Sandberg and I always had a standing date. He would always, sometimes my big brother would be like, well, I'm going to hang out with you and play ball. They would redeem. Ryne Sandberg, he would always be on that too at 1:20 every afternoon, and he never ridiculed on me. He always showed up for me.
There you go.
Well, and you raise an important point there, because in the mid-'80s, 84, which was his breakout year, his MVP year, up until whatever year it was, I think 89, but every Cub home game was a day game because there were no lights until the late 80s at Wrigley Field.
1988.
88, okay.
1988 was that time. As a matter of fact, I attended my very first baseball game was at Wrigley Field, and it was a day game, but it was like the year after they had lights. And that was like one of the real joys of my life, and I think Ryne Sandberg hit a home run in that game against the San Francisco Giants, and which was very interesting. One other interesting thing I found out about Ryne Sandberg, and I always, and you guys know, with me being on your show, doing this every year, I always try to find some very interesting nugget or whatever dealing with the guy that I'm talking about. And this is one. When he was in high school, he attended North Central High School in Spokane, Washington. And he was named to the Parade All-American High School football team, right? Which I thought was very interesting. So with things like that come up, I'm like, okay, who else was on the team? Okay. And I found some very interesting names here. One person me and Charles are know a lot about was former Saints quarterback, former star of Archbishop Shaw High School, a man by the name of John Forcade.
I remember him.
Who was the Saints replacement quarterback during the strike of 1987. And he went to Archbishop Shaw. Another name was Art Schlichter, who was the quarterback picked up out of Colts, but his career was cut short by gambling. But the biggest name was a defensive back where he played. He was listed as a DB. A guy from Lincoln High School of San Diego by the name of Marcus Allen.
Wow.
He was on that team, the Parade All-American team, Parade Magazine All-American team with Ryne Sandberg. I was like, bro, that's pretty cool. So I just wanted to throw that out there with Ryne Sandberg. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it sounds like Sandberg was originally signed a letter to play football at Washington State University, and was pretty intent on doing that, and then he got drafted by the Phillies and ultimately decided to do that. Just to the 84, and I think that's probably the year that's most associated with the Ryne Sandberg era of the Cubs, and just it kind of reminded me of I remember hearing something years ago where it was like, depending on what generation you're from, if you're a certain age, it was the 1969 Cubs that had a big lead and got caught by the Mets. For some people, it was that 84 team, and for some people, it was the 03 team. If you're a Cubs fan, depending on your age, those three teams were like the first true heartbreak in your life. And that's, that's like a pretty poetic in a sad way to put it. And obviously they've won since then. But you hear fans of a very specific, generation, that 84 team was their team. That ultimately ended up losing to that Padres team.
The Sandberg game against St. Louis, where Bob was a Saturday game of the week. Bob Costas was doing play-by-play, and I think he still talks about it to this day. Willie McGee for the Cardinals, NL MVP in his own right. At some point, he hits for the cycle. Sandberg hits 2 game-tying home runs off of a future Hall of Fame closer in Bruce Sutter. And so that 84 team really is the breakout season for Ryne Sandberg. He'd actually come from Philly in 82. Dallas Green, who had moved over from Philly, where he had been the manager, to be the GM in Chicago. It's the Larry Boa, Ivan De Jesus trade, and Sandberg is the throwaway coming over from Philly with Larry Boa. But Green knows what he's getting in Ryne Sandberg, and so 84 is really sort of his breakout year. Although I will say, I think it was Chuck, mentioned the Leon Durham game, and that's Game 5 of the NLCS where Durham makes a bad error at first base to sort of give the game away to San Diego. One of the issues in that game was that somebody had spilled water all over Leon Durham's glove I don't know whether it was during the game or before the game. Glove was drenched in water. Durham asks the third base coach, a guy who you may have heard of by the name of Don Zimmer. He says, should I still use this glove? Zimmer says it might be lucky, but Durham makes an error anyway. The guy who spilled the water all over Leon Durham's glove, Ryne Sandberg.
I had heard that story, but I wasn't too sure, if that was true or not, but I think it sounds right. It sounds right. There might have been water or Gatorade or whatever, but it
I actually
happened.
think it was Gatorade because I think it was sticky was part of the problem.
Yeah, and I remember that in 1984 game against St. Louis, I was 11 years old watching that game, and it was a rainy afternoon in Louisiana, and I remember watching it with my grandpa, which, most days in Louisiana during the summer are rainy days. So I'm watching that game with my grandpa, and Ryne Sandberg hits the home run to tie it. And then in the bottom half of the 10th inning, he hits another home run to tie it again, which the Cubs ultimately win. That game essentially made me a baseball fan. And, and it was really interesting watching that game, and Bob Costas, and I went back and watched the replay of that game in preparation for this, but I heard Harry Carey's call, and you could tell he was kind of sauced while calling it as usual. But at the same time, it was so cool to see that.
Yes, but it's just amazing. Dan, this is the very first time in 40 years that I even have heard of that story. I wasn't even aware. But one response to that is, of course, it's the Cubs. But another thing about that game as well, the Cubs had home field in that series. But as you mentioned earlier, they did not have lights. So that Game 5, MLB didn't want to play the game during the daytime back in Chicago. They wanted to have it available for somewhat prime time on the East Coast. So as a result, they had to play that Game 5 at Jack Murphy in San Diego, which the Cubs ultimately lost that game.
And I think that was one of the reasons why the Cubs ended up bringing in the lights, is that the league, the commissioner's office or whoever it was, kind of made it clear to them that, like, look, we're going to start doing things like this to you. Like, if you guys, you're not going to mess with our TV schedule. So if you guys are in the playoffs, if you're in the World Series, like, those games are not going to be played at Wrigley Field in the middle of a Tuesday. And I personally Would love to see a day World Series game. I think the last one was 87, I think it was. So I would love to see that again one day, but I'm, number one, not optimistic, and number two, can understand why the league doesn't want the World Series being played at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a work day. The other thing I would mention is I just think that from a Chicago point of view, this is pre-Jordan. It's Peyton's there, but it's kind of like, spring of 84 is kind of before the Bears really break out. Off the top of my head, Ditka's first year, I think, was like 82, but it was, it was before the Bears became that dominant Bears team that they would be the following year. And so, it kind of gets eclipsed because you got the Bears and then you got Jordan and, that kind of wipes everything away. But, for a year or so in Chicago, the Cubs and Sandberg, they were the thing.
Yeah, it really was. And I've always wondered this, and maybe Chuck could highlight this for us. When the Cubs won the World Series in 2016, okay, and finally after waiting 108 years, are there any players on that championship team that will be remembered with Cub fans on the same level? And I don't think it will, but I'm just asking a Cub fan. Do you think any of those players that was on that 2016 team will rise to as far as like being as beloved as a Ryne Sandberg or a Ron Santo or Ernie Banks or a Billy Williams? Do you think anybody on those teams will rank up to as far like being a beloved figure in Cubs history from that 2016 World Championship team?
Not quite to that level, but if I had to pick one guy that would be somewhat close, it would be Anthony Rizzo, the first baseman of the Cubs, because he kind of was a guy that obviously he was a very, very good player at the time, but then he was also like, also like culturally as well as attitude-wise and spirit-wise was kind of like the personality of that team, and he kind of embodied the personality and the characteristics of that team as well, as far as attitude and things like that. And I think he was probably at that time the most beloved Cub at that time for that particular team.
All right.
Well, I don't want to speak for Andrew, but we liked him for those few years he was on the Yankees just recently. I was a Rizzo guy for those few years. So
I think the nature of it is just guys aren't on teams their whole career anymore.
Yeah.
I know Ryne Sandberg started with the Phillies, but he's a Cub, so that's just the way it is. And I mean, I'm not saying it's good, bad, or otherwise, but it's like, yeah, I just pulled up the 2016 Cubs roster. And it's like, there's nobody specifically that in my mind would be on that level. But part of that's because they came from other places. They went other places. It's just the way it is now. You tend to more lionize the team than a specific guy that, that got them over the hump. But, I'm also not from there. I'm not a Cubs fan, so I don't want to pretend like I know that for a fact.
Well, yes. Ryne Sandberg, definitely one of the most beloved Cubs in history and one of the most beloved figures in Chicago sports history. Chuck and Dana, before we let you go, I think we would just love for you all to just tell us a little bit about the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, what it is, what you guys are up to, what we can expect in the future. I'm always enjoy listening, so give us a little bit about your podcast.
Well, as you well know, some of you listeners who tune into the show know that Charles was added sometime, I think, right before the summer. I added him, and basically what you hear is essentially like some of our conversations that we would have on the phone when we would talk. And Charles and I, like Charles has said, we've been knowing each other for 30 years. We go back to our college days at Southern University. And he and I have been basically best friends ever since. What we have going on, well, we just got through an episode as we counted down our 5, what we consider the 5 best and worst sports cities, which was a very interesting topic, to say the least, as we described, what makes a good sports city and which cities that we thought were bad sports cities as good and good sports cities. Check that out if you haven't. We're working on, as a matter of fact, we should be recording our next episode at this time next week. where we're going to talk about the 1985 New England Patriots, the team that got blasted in the Super Bowl in Super Bowl 20. We're going to talk about how they got there, which was one of the most interesting postseason runs in NFL history, and some of the fallout from that, which I just learned about. There was a lot of fallout from that team after the Super Bowl, which was interesting. How Raymond Berry got named head coach. We got a few more episodes I got a bunch of episodes that we have in the hopper, including one that I would like to formally, in front of your audience, Dan and Andrew, formally invite Andrew on whenever we do it, and we're going to do a show, hopefully the first part of next year, detailing wrestling in the Southeast. Talking about the Georgia Championship Wrestling, Mid-South Wrestling, world-class wrestling in Texas, because Chuck is not only a connoisseur of boxing, which he is, but he is also a huge connoisseur of wrestling, and I loved wrestling growing up. So Charles and I would like to invite you on, whenever you get an opportunity or whenever we do it.
Yeah, that's not a thing I have a lot of takers in my personal life to talk about. So I'm more than happy to come on and talk about, the different territories and the different promoters and just the history of wrestling in the Southeast. So, yes, I absolutely will. And everybody in my life will be glad that I'm getting it out of my system. So,
and I'm glad I don't have to call my parents and tell them that I think there's something wrong with Andrew, because if he had said no, that's exactly what I would have had to have done. So.
But yeah, Charles is a huge, boxing fan, boxing guy. We did an episode earlier this year about the Four Kings era in boxing with Marvin Hagler and, in that group, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran, Thomas Hearns. That was one of our more well-received episodes that we've done. So it was, and plus having him on is like a blast for me. I get the chance to talk to my brother from another mother every couple of weeks. So that's also cool.
Yeah, I have to say, I never really understood. I mean, I understood it, but I always gave credit to people like yourself once upon a time, and Darren and whoever else who do this so consistently on their own. I was always amazed and impressed by that. But I agree, it is a lot of fun, especially like what Andrew and I have, like what you guys have, when it's conversations you would have had anyway, and you just get to kind of have them in a little bit more of a structured format for the form of a podcast. Well, Dana, Chuck, it was very nice to hear from you both. Chuck for the first time, and Dana, I think this is your 5th year in a row doing this. So
yeah,
always glad to get your perspective, and thank you both for being a part of this year's In Memoriam special.
Man, thank you for having us.
Yep, take care.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
All right, we are moving along here, and thanks again to the folks at Historically Speaking Sports for talking to us about Ryne Sandberg, and we are about to enter a little bit of a goalie theme here, so why don't I go ahead and tell you about Ken Dryden, who was born in 1947 and passed away on September 5th. A member of the Hockey Hall of Fame, Dryden won 6 Stanley Cups as a goalie for the Montreal Canadiens in the 1970s. His diary of the 1978-79 season, The Game, is considered one of the greatest sports books of all time. He also served in the Canadian Parliament for several years after his retirement. So I don't know which direction we want to take this first. I guess I would just kind of frame it as there was a time period in the 60s and 70s where these sort of season diaries became really a big thing. The first one was a book called The Long Season by a guy named Jim Brosnan, who was a kind of a mediocre reliever for the Reds. And then Jerry Kramer with Dick Schaap wrote Instant Replay on the 1967 Packers, which ended up being a historic season because it was Lombardi's last year, NFL title game, Ice Bowl, second Super Bowl, that type of thing. Ball 4 obviously was groundbreaking in the way that it was Jim Bouton baseball. And then the hockey equivalent is this Ken Dryden book, which he also wrote with Dick Schaap, the same guy who co-wrote Instant Replay with Jerry Kramer of the 78-79 season. So Ken Dryden, in addition to being a Hall of Fame goalie and an all-time great in the NHL, also was a really, really smart man and a guy who had a very interesting post-career as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting, in the spirit of disclosure, a guy we're about to talk about, Bernie Perrant, we recorded that sort of, several weeks ago at this point. And I said how interesting it was that a guy who was French-Canadian in that era managed to not go to the Montreal Canadiens and had a big career mostly with the Flyers. Sort of the opposite here, that in the midst of this, arguably the height of the Canadiens dynasty or multiple dynasties, however you want to look at it, their goalie and one of the signature stars of this team in the 70s was a guy from Ontario who very much not a French Canadian. Just kind of an interesting dichotomy there. But a guy who had a very short career, a short but dominant career, to the point where he's listed most places I see him have him as a top 10 but not top 5 goalie of all time. Usually about number 7 is where I see him listed. But he, pretty much on the Canadiens for the entire 70s, with the exception of a year he sat out, won the Stanley Cup. What did you say? 6 times?
6 times. Yes. 8 years in the NHL, 6 Stanley Cups.
Yeah. Six Stanley Cups. A career postseason record of 80-32. So 80 postseason wins. If I'm not sure if it was exactly 4 per series at the time, but basically the equivalent of 20 postseason series wins. Obviously a few probably in losing efforts, but more than a 2 out of 3 winning percentage in the playoffs. Just a guy, and like you said, in addition to all the sort of off ice things, he became a politician later in life. He was a color commentator for the Miracle on Ice. He was in the booth with Al Michaels during the Do You Believe in Miracles game. But, just a run of dominance throughout the decade of the 70s that puts him in the upper echelon despite a relatively short career.
So the first season of his career is the 70-71 season with the Canadiens. He is, let me get his age here, he's 23 years of age. It's his first year in the NHL, and despite his relative lack of experience, he only actually played in 6, this is crazy, he only plays in 6 games for the Canadiens in the 70-71 regular season, but then they make him the starting goalie for the playoff run, and he is the goalie for all 20 of their playoff games, and that includes in the very first round a 4-3 victory, 4-3 victory over the Boston Bruins, who had been the Stanley Cup champions the year before, and then would be again the following year in 72. He was 6'4", which was tall for a goalie at that time. I guess really probably for a goalie of any time. And he gets an interesting nickname in the series against Boston when Phil Esposito goes and tries to score a goal on him, and Dryden makes a great stop, and Esposito slams his stick down and calls Ken Dryden, quote unquote, a thieving giraffe.
He won 5 Vezina trophies, which at the time I believe was awarded to the goaltending, basically the goalie or teams with the lowest goals against average. So there was no sort of object or subjectivity there. It was purely a goals against, I believe. Led the league in shutouts and wins 4 times apiece. This was at a time of the NHL increasing fairly rapidly. The league in the early 70s or in the late 60s had gone from 6 teams to 12 teams. By the end of the 70s, I believe it was, probably close to 20 teams, if not at the 20 mark. So, it wasn't purely sometimes things in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. You have to take with a bit of a grain of salt when you say like, oh, this hockey goalie, this goalie was an all-star 12 times, and you go, wow, there were 6 teams in the league. This was at a time where that was not no longer the case. The other thing I found was interesting, just sort of a just sort of an interesting aside. He was drafted by the Bruins, and he was traded a few days later to the Canadiens in. I believe it was 1967 or somewhere in there. Let's see. 1964. Okay. He did not know until the mid 70s that he'd actually been drafted by the Bruins and traded to the Canadiens. I guess his agent just told him you were drafted by Montreal. He didn't find out for like a decade that actually technically he was drafted by Boston. By the time he found out, he'd already been traded.
And he also didn't actually get to the NHL until about 7 years after he was drafted, because he ended up, and you get a lot of this now, but you get, including at my alma mater of BU, but he actually, after being drafted, he decides instead he's going to go play at Cornell for 3 years. So he plays in an American college, which I don't know all of it, but I don't think that was that popular in those days for Canadian stars to go play in American colleges rather than in the NHL.
Yeah, I don't think so.
We could be wrong about that, but so he kind of winds his way through Cornell, including a national championship for Cornell during his time there, and then he's in the AHL, and then immediately goes up to the Canadiens. You mentioned the 6 titles, the 4, 6 titles and 5 Vezina trophies, including 4 in his last 4 years, and those 4 years are also 4 Montreal Canadiens championship season. So it would be hard to argue that he didn't go out on top. I don't know what was his age when he retired. He was 31 years of age when he retired, so not young, but not necessarily old. I don't know if there's anything here about why specifically he retired, but then he ends up going on to write a number of books about the NHL, including The Game, which doesn't come out until years after he retires, 4 years after he retires, 1983. He writes a book with his former coach, Scotty Bowman, who is one of the winningest coaches in NHL history. So even if you put aside all of his political activity, which is obviously very unique for a former NHL player, a guy who was really a hockey lifer and stayed involved with the game through his writing and, like you said, some broadcasting too, years after he retired.
Yeah, and and still after all these years ranks as one of the greatest goalies of all time. And I guess the only knock would be the longevity. But when you've done that much in a decade, you don't need to keep going, really.
We will get back to goalies in a few minutes here, but I think first we need to talk about some baseball. So why don't we introduce our next honoree?
Sure. Davey Johnson, born in 1943, died on September 5th. Johnson played second base for the Baltimore Orioles in the 1960s and 1970s, making 4 All-Star teams and winning 2 World Series. He later went on to a successful managing career, taking 4 different teams to the playoffs and winning the World Series with the 1986 Mets.
So I don't know if there's a record for this, but you talk about a guy who twice in 3 years led a team to the playoffs and then parted company with the team immediately thereafter. He was a great manager. He had the respect of his players, but he was also a guy who rubbed the ownership the wrong way. So 7 seasons with the Mets, obviously the World Championship in 86, and then that devastating Mets loss to the Dodgers in 1988. Moves on to Cincinnati, and in 1995, which is the tail end of the lockout year, he leads the Reds to the playoffs, NL Central champions, sweep the Dodgers, but then get swept by the Braves, who are on their way to a World Championship. Goes on to Baltimore, makes the playoffs 2 years in a row with Baltimore, but then the situation there is not tenable, and he actually ends up resigning from the Orioles the same day that he was named the manager of the year for 1997. And then he's a couple years with the Dodgers, and then after a decade or so, ends up with the Washington Nationals. And 2012, which is, I think that's Harper's rookie year. Yeah, it's Harper's rookie year. And this is the year Strasburg comes back after having major surgery. Strasburg, who debuted in 2010, had surgery, and then I think Strasburg missed all of. Oh no, he played 5 games in 2011, and then 2012 the Nationals. And I remember this because I was at. No, this was not that same year. I'm sorry. I was actually scheduled. I had tickets to go to Game 1 of the NLCS, which the Nationals were supposed to be in, but they lost Game 5 to the St. Louis Cardinals. This was a game where the Nationals had a 6-0 lead after 3 innings and ended up losing 9-7. And then he manages one more year in Washington, and then he's done for good. But leads teams to the playoffs, but then wears out his welcome pretty quickly, Davey Johnson.
Yeah, and I guess I didn't realize how good of a player he was. He was an all-star 4 times, 68 to 70, and then 73. Gold Glover 3 straight years, 69 to 71 with those Orioles teams. I don't think it's New York bias to say the thing that he's most associated with as a manager is the Mets. Now, he was there with the Mets. 7 seasons, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, parts of 7 seasons. And he was a manager everywhere else, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years. So almost half of his career with the Mets, obviously his most successful year with the Mets in 86. He takes over a Met team in 1984 that, most people point to that as the first year of them being on the road to being a contender that would culminate with a championship in 1986. He goes 90 and 72 that first year. They finish in second. The next year in 85 is the Dr. K. Gooden breakout year. They go 98 and 64. And then 86, they win that World Series with the legend. I mean, the NLCS is pretty famous against the Astros, and then the legendary World Series against the Red Sox. Culminating in Game 7, highlighted by Game 6 in the Bill Buckner game. And then he's there through 90, and as the Mets are starting to go down, he's worn out his welcome with Frank Cashin. The
two of them never got along.
Yeah, they clash, and he's gone. And with hindsight, we can see it was he got out in time. I think Strawberry left after the 90 season, if I'm not mistaken, and all the problems of those teams had caught up to him. Just what it must have taken to manage that team. Obviously all the close playoff games and needing to a manager can make the difference in the on the margins of those games, and certainly wasn't anything he did that caused the ball to go through Bill Buckner's legs, but he was the manager of that team. But just managing, I know I read that he sort of was of the opinion, and you kind of had to be with this team of worry about what happens at the ballpark and on the field, and don't be too invested in these guys' personal lives. But when you have that number of guys who are hard partiers, some of whom are abusing cocaine, it's going to be hard for that not to come into the clubhouse. And to be able to sort of manage that, no pun intended, a lot of people will say, how did that Mets team, or a lot of people say, oh, that Mets team should have won more than they did. To an extent, I agree, but it's also kind of a miracle that they won what they did, given all of those personalities and proclivities on that team. I didn't know much about his Reds tenure, and I guess March Shot didn't like him because he was living with a woman before they were married or something like that.
That sounds familiar. It wouldn't surprise me.
And then his Orioles tenure was only 2 years, which is hard to believe. It's hard
What I saw there was that he asked Angelos for an extension, and Angelos, being the cheapskate that he was, wouldn't give him one, and so Johnson just walked.
Yeah, and those teams, they were in the ALCS 2 years in a row. 96, they lost to the Yankees. 97, they lost to Cleveland. Lots of big stars on those teams. He had to navigate the Roberto Alomar thing, and I know the next year there was an issue with the Roberto Alomar and a fine that Johnson levied and the charity that it was supposed to go to and all of that. But a guy who kept bringing teams to the playoffs, even at when he was the Nationals manager, he'd been out of managing for 10 years, and his last year with the Nationals, he was 70 years old.
Wasn't the fine, it ended up going to his wife's charity or something crazy like that?
I think Johnson said he should do that, and then the players union advised Alomar not to do that. Something like that.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm sure I have not listened to this episode in a very long time, and it's, I think it's over 4 years ago that we did it, but I'm sure we discuss all of this at length in our episode on the 90s Orioles that we did with your friend Mike. And if anybody is curious about Mike, Andrew's friend, I would just note that he is the same person that you are going to hear here in about 2 minutes talking about Bernie Parent. So I'm sure we dove into the Davey Johnson piece of it quite a bit. But yeah, 2 really good seasons, including 98 wins and a division in his last year, like we said, manager of the year. And this is a team with, like Andrew alluded to, Ripken, Alomar, Palmeiro, who'd probably be a Hall of Famer if it wasn't for the steroids. Mike Mussina, Jimmy Key, Harold Baines. I always associate with him with it that the year before, the 96 Orioles, the wild card team with that was the year Brady Anderson hit the 50 home runs, and they brought Eddie Murray back in, and that was the year of the Jeffrey Mayer game. So, and then I guess I just kind of, that Nationals in that time period were really interesting because they were terrible pretty much. The first year that they were in DC, they had a decent season. I think they ended up finishing 92 or 82 and 80, and Frank Robinson, the legendary Frank Robinson, was the manager that year. And then after that, they were pretty bad. In 2011, which was the year after Strasburg debuted, but then he originally immediately got badly injured and had to have major surgery, they were actually playing decently for a change. And they had Jim Riggleman, who was 38 and 37, sort of mid-June, I think it was, thereabouts. And he asked for a contract extension, and they didn't give him one. And so the Nationals, I forget, I think Riggleman ended up, I don't remember whether Riggleman quit or got fired, but basically the issue was that he wanted a contract extension. So it was sort of this interesting thing. And then they bring in Davey Johnson. They're not great the rest of the season, but then in 2012, they eventually get Strasburg back. Bryce Harper debuts and it wins Rookie of the Year with 22 home runs and a 270 batting average. He's only 19 years old, and then they blow this series. I was talking about the 6-0 game to the Cardinals, and they could have very well been in the NLCS that year. And then the following year, they're not as good. They're 86 and 76. Johnson is kind of allowed to retire. It's kind of made, I remember at the time it was sort of like, well, he would stay if they asked him, but they weren't really asking him type of thing. Then they bring in Matt Williams. He has a good season, one good season, again loses in the first round of the playoffs. He gets fired, and then he has a bad season, gets fired at the end of the 2015 season. They do basically the same thing for a few years with Dusty Baker, where he has good seasons but still gets fired. And then eventually in 2019 with Davey Martinez, they finally have a manager who they allow to stick around long enough to win a championship. But even if you don't want to count Riggleman, Johnson, Williams, Baker, all guys who take the team to the playoffs and have really good seasons in their first year, but by their second or third year, they're out the door.
Johnson, just the kind of his last thing on Johnson, he was he was sort of an early pioneer of what we now know as sabermetrics, analytics, whatever you want to call it. He had studied computer programming. He was a math major and had learned computer programming in the late 60s. So he had as early as his playing days would talk to Earl Weaver about strategies based on the sort of analytics that he had studied, researched, whatever you want to call it. And as a manager, as early as his Mets days, he was things we recognize now, like on base percentage, that were at the time not, still very much in the era of traditional stats, home runs, RBIs. He was a pioneer in that regard, who's maybe not credited as such, but certainly you see those things in his strategies that now would be much more commonplace, but at the time were unconventional.
And he also convinces Weaver to use that stuff, a lot of it. And Weaver is known as somebody who used analytics early on, and a lot of that came from the suggestion or influence of Davey Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, why don't we move on? And we've got another goalie to talk about, and that is Eddie Giacomin, who was born in 1939 and passed away on September 14th. A goalie and member of the Hockey Hall of Fame, Giacomin was a 5-time All-Star with the New York Rangers and split the Vezina Trophy with teammate Giles Villemure in 1971. He helped lead the Rangers to a Stanley Cup Finals appearance in 1972. That 1972 Stanley Cup loss was to that aforementioned Bobby Orr Bruins team, who'd been knocked out by Ken Dryden and the Canadiens in 71, but they made it back and beat the Rangers in 72. Not probably either one of our areas of expertise, but you often hear New York sports people, when you're making a list of the New York athletes who didn't win a championship, they talk about Ewing and they talk about Mattingly. And I feel like guys from that 70s Ranger team, Rod Gilbert, Giacomin, those guys, I feel like they get named in that same breath a lot of times.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I mean, I could go more into this, but it'd be kind of self-indulgent. Like, just growing up as a big-time New York sports fan, growing up in the city, rooting for what a lot of people consider the traditional teams, and then the Yankees, the Giants, and the Knicks, but not being a big hockey guy. And once I started rooting for a hockey team, I started rooting for the Islanders. The Rangers occupy kind of a weird space to me, and especially when you consider and even larger in the city, because New York is not a huge hockey town, but there are, as I suspect in a lot of towns, there are people who the Rangers are their first team by a lot, and some people probably the Rangers are their only team. So, and the Rangers also, outside of 1994, have not done a lot of winning, similar to the Knicks and similar to a bunch of other teams in New York. So the guys from those eras are, from the 70s Rangers, if you're a person of a certain age, those teams and guys like Eddie Giacomin are, gods basically in New York hockey, or Rangers hockey specifically. And, there's something about a goalie where it's just such a different aspect, different category than a regular skater, I guess you will. And, Giacomin was a 5-time All-Star, 67, 68, 6-time All-Star, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 5 years in a row. And then again in 1973, like you mentioned, he was the goalie for the team that got all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals against the Bruins, I believe, in 1972, right?
Correct. Yeah, it was the Bruins.
Yeah. So, winner of the Vezina Trophy during, famously played a game against the Blackhawks in the playoffs in 71 where he got skated over and continued to play with a severely bleeding hand. Just a guy who, is considered one of the greatest Rangers of all time, one of the better goalies of that era, obviously, especially with the 70s, like we were just talking about with Ken Dryden, the Canadiens take up a lot of oxygen in the discussion of that era. And then the thing I remember this from watching the 50 greatest moments at MSG, which is,
I was just about to mention this. Go ahead.
20 years ago at this point. But the special was he got traded to Detroit in 1976.
75, very early in the 75-76 season.
I guess he wasn't technically traded. He was put on waivers, and the Red Wings claimed him because John Davidson, another famous Ranger broadcaster personality who we may have talked about a few years ago, who I think died just a few years ago. He was a young up-and-coming goalie, and Giacomin was clearly pretty much done at that point. His knees were shot, but they really couldn't start Davidson at home because anytime they would start Davidson, the crowd would chant, "We want Eddie." So they were finally like, we really have to just move on, and that way Davidson can play without the shadow of Eddie Giacomin over there. And they place him on waivers when nobody, no trade materializes. He's picked up by Detroit. So his first game, not on the Rangers with Detroit, is back at the Garden as a member of the Red Wings. It's almost like being traded in the middle of a doubleheader. So he's back, at the Garden. The last time the Rangers played, he was the Rangers goalie, and now he's the Red Wings goalie. And the crowd basically cheered him the whole game, gave him a huge ovation, and then, finished his career, played a few good years with few decent years with the Red Wings, and then retired in the 1977-78 season.
And you alluded to it, but that game was that moment of him returning as a member of the Red Wings was such a big deal that it was considered one of the 50 greatest moments in Madison Square Garden history. And that was, a lot of Knicks, a lot of Rangers, but also, things that were, college basketball and boxing, and also a lot of things that weren't sports, concerts and political conventions and everything. So for a regular season game and a guy's return to make that list, it kind of shows you just how important he was to the New York fan in the 70s. I just wanted to note a couple more things. Rod Gilbert, who's another Hall of Famer, called Giacomin the heart of the team. From a playing style point of view, I found that he was one of the first goalies to leave the crease, the area directly in front of the goal. A lot of goalies didn't do that in those days, and he was one of the first. Originally struggles early on. The fans actually throw hot dogs and peanuts at him early on in his career because of his struggles, but he eventually gets it right, obviously. And as we talked about, becomes so beloved. And then the only other thing I had was that he really liked to fight, which I guess did not make him unique in the NHL of the 1970s, but he really liked to fight.
Yeah. And still, his numbers retired, still one of the revered players in New York Rangers history. And really, if you think about it, the Rangers went 54 years between Stanley Cups. Not too many guys left to remember, not too many people left to remember the 1940 team. I mean, you'd have to be 90 at this point, more than 90, right?
At least, yeah. I was going to say more than that, yeah.
You'd have to be in your early to mid 90s at this point, at the bare minimum, to remember the 1940 team. So outside of the 94 team, you have a lot of guys who were, great players on teams that didn't win championships. And Giacomin is certainly first among equals in that group.
Yeah, and I would just note one more thing. If you want to go back and listen, when we did about a year ago, I guess, or I guess it was just this year, our New York numbers, our best New York player by number, and we started right off with number 1, and Giacomin was one of the ones we seriously considered. I think we ended up going with Pee Wee Reese, but Giacomin is definitely at that level as a New York athlete. All right. Well, we're going to move on here, and we just talked about one goalie, and we're going to talk about another one now. We're going to talk about Bernie Parent, who was born in 1945 and died on September 21st. One of the greatest goalies in hockey history, Parent played most of his career with the Philadelphia Flyers. In 1974 and 1975, he won back-to-back Vezina trophies as the league's best goalie and back-to-back Conn Smythe trophies as the MVP of the Stanley Cup playoffs. The Flyers won championships in both years. Parent was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1984. We are glad to have another guest with us to talk about Bernie Parent. And why don't I turn it over to you, Andrew, to talk about our guest?
Yeah, sure. This is a departure from our usual other guys who do shows on the Sports History Network about football in the 19-teens. They're all great. I'm not trying to diminish them, but we have my college roommate and friend Mike Petty coming to us from St. Louis, Missouri, or the environs right thereabouts. And he is a lifelong Philadelphia Flyers fan, and he is going to take us through this one. Mike, how are you today? Thanks for joining us.
Good. Thanks for having me, guys.
So I know you had, I know obviously you being my age and born in the mid 80s, you were unfortunately too young to have experienced the golden age of Flyers hockey in the mid 70s. But can you talk to us a little about those teams' legacy and specifically the legacy of Bernie Parent?
Yeah, I mean, it's an iconic team. They only win two championships, so you can't call it a dynasty, but it's just an iconic era of any sport. I mean, you talk about the Broad Street Bullies. It's just, the name just means stands up for itself. Bernie Parent being their goalie, it's those teams are just, synonymous with Philadelphia, the hardworking blue collar team. It's a little funny now that I live in St. Louis. Basically the reason those teams even exist is because of the St. Louis Blues. In those early 70s, basically the Blues would push the Flyers around. And then it got to the point where their owner was just like, never again. And it just changed their entire philosophy on team building and, size, grit, but they also had a lot of skill. And it just got rounded out by Bernie Parent and net that you just had one of the best goalies in the NHL.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I guess I didn't realize the journey, so to speak. And first of all, how the hell a guy in that era from Montreal ends up not with the Canadians is probably an interesting story for another day. But he comes up with Boston. He's a Flyer in the late 60s for 3.5, 4 years, leaves, goes to Toronto, goes to the WHA for whatever, half a year or whatever it is. And then he's back with the Flyers just in time for this, 73-74 season where he puts up, MVP level numbers. They win 2 straight Stanley Cups. Just interesting to see a guy leave and then kind of come back like that, sort of just in the nick of time, really.
Yeah, so he plays his rookie season, he plays for the Bruins, and then, the original 6 expands. So the NHL expands in 67. And honestly, I'll admit this was not something I knew until actually in the last few years. Bernie Parent is the first Flyers draft pick. So the Bruins leave him unprotected in the expansion draft, and the Flyers take him with their first pick. So he is the original Flyer, the original expansion pick. So then like I said, he comes and the team struggles right out of the bat. Just it's an expansion franchise. Like you said, they do move on from him. They trade him to Toronto. And then, next thing you know, here's the World Hockey Association. And he later plays for the Philadelphia Blazers, which, growing up, going to Flyers games, I would see these Blazers jerseys and it would be a Bernie Parent. And I just never really understood what that jersey was until, you get to learn. But when he wants to come back to the NHL, the Flyers end up working out a deal with Toronto to keep him in Philly. And then he's back with the Flyers.
Andrew and I always do this, so I just have to interject. When it's these teams in either the ABA or the World Football League or the WHA, I just got to point out and this is from Wikipedia, but I'm going to trust that it's true. I just got to point out the franchise history of the Philadelphia Blazers. Started out in 1972 as the Miami Screaming Eagles, parentheses, did not play. 1972-73, the Philadelphia Blazers. 73 to 75, they're the Vancouver Blazers. And then from 75 to 76, just for good measure, they're the Calgary Cowboys. So just figured
I'm sure the NHL will find a way to make, throwback jerseys to sell for some event, for all that extensive history.
Not as good as the team in the tennis thing we were doing a couple of months ago, where in between being two different teams, they were the Soviet national team for 1 year in the 70s. But anyway, he kind of gets back there in a very roundabout way. And then in his within a couple years of getting back there, they're back-to-back champions.
Yeah, and then that stretch, looking at those stats, the one season he plays 73 of 78 games, which is just absurd on any level, considering especially could you imagine what the travel was for these guys in the 70s? And here he is playing, every night. You went through all the awards he won. And then there's just a synonymous photo, if you ever get to see it in the Flyer. It's usually in the Flyers arena, and it's on every broadcast. There were famous signs that got put up was that only the Lord saves more than Bernie Perrant. And that became, the rallying cry of, Flyers fans.
He was actually on the cover of Time magazine in the mid 70s with that, the old style hockey mask. It's not even really a mask, because it comes to a point, and it just said it just said hockey war on ice, and it's just him. And there's a lot of times with Time magazine, there'd be something in the top about the president or about something, but it's just it's pretty menacing. And this was even before that was synonymous. That mask was synonymous with Friday the 13th. But for a hockey goalie to be, front and center on Time magazine like that is pretty iconic. And it's a great shot. You can just see his eyes and the Flyers logo, basically.
Well, and you bring that up. I'm sorry, I don't know this officially, but I would imagine with the time frame, he's probably starts almost all the games, I would imagine, of that Soviet series they end up having against the Flyers, where the Soviets leave the ice and won't come back. And it ends up being that the Flyers owner tells them, unless you want to get paid, you need to come back to the ice.
My favorite one of that is the coach of the Soviet team it's the same guy who coached the team in the Miracle. And he's quoted, he's obviously he's speaking, I think he's speaking in English, and he's yelling at the Flyers coach or whatever. And he's such tripping, such tackling. It's just a funny, no native English speaker would say that. But
right.
Yeah, you're right. He would have been, at that time going against the, Soviet team that had won the 4 straight gold medals and all that. And that's a story I had never known until I went to college in Philadelphia, and then I saw the highlights on YouTube or whatever of them just basically punching this Soviet team and them storming off and almost starting an incident. But
and you brought up his mask. Honestly, that ends up, obviously that's iconic, and the Flyers are actually doing, since he's passed, the Flyers team currently this year, the player of the game puts on the Bernie mask in the locker room, and it's a cool thing. But that mask ends up becoming, in his final game in 79, he ends up taking a stick through that eye hole. So, and he never plays again. He ends up having vision problems the rest of his life. So if you look, that is the end of those style masks. From there out, they start going to the cage and the kind of hockey helmet style masks, basically because of his injury.
And I know you had told me when I asked you if you would come on and do this, that he became a team ambassador, where he was kind of an ever-present presence at the Flyers games, to the point where you said despite being one of the franchise's all-time greats, his autograph really isn't that valuable because everybody's got a handful of them.
Yeah, that injury happens. He retires at 34. So you'd think, a lot of to be a team legend, and he was still around in the arena. You would see him at Phantoms, which is their AHL franchise. You would see him at them in the Flyers games. and he was always in the concourse. He was always like, he wasn't in a suite. He was just among the crowd, high-fiving kids and shaking hands. And like I said to you, he'd sign anything and everything everybody had. So I'm sure there were people in Philadelphia who thought they had like family heirlooms to pass down. And there were just, who knows how many hockey pucks, Bernie Perron had signed. And then that culminates in 2012. In the winter, the Flyers and Rangers end up playing in the Winter Classic. And he is, let's do math, 66 years old. And he agrees to play in the alumni game. And he ends up stopping the first 5 shots. He makes a save on a breakaway. And I just remember thinking how cool that was. Is like, this was the guy who was my dad's hero. And here I am making him, obviously alumni game exhibition, but it was pretty cool to get to see him make those saves.
Well, and the other thing you talked about the mask, I also was one of the last great, or maybe the last great stand-up goaltenders. And this is not necessarily my area of expertise, but guys today using what's called the butterfly stance, where they're sort of with the big pads on their legs. They're sort of like legs are, at almost at like a 90-degree angle. They're kneeling, or they use a hybrid, which is like a combination of both. But he was one of the last great just stand up in the net goaltenders in the history of professional hockey.
Yeah, and I mean, you watch some of those highlights, you're honestly amazed that they stopped anything, just what, like you said, size of pads, style. And again, that was why that alumni game was so cool, because if you go back and you can look at those saves he's making them the exact same way, off on, somewhatly, just retired New York Rangers.
Well, Mike, we really appreciate you coming on. When I saw there was a Flyer and a Flyer legend, I figured this was as good a time as any to have you back on. We had you on to talk about the Orioles of the 90s a few years ago, and I guess we could bring up the Pete Alonso signing right now, but that might make some Met fans mad, so we'll give that time to marinate. But we really appreciate you coming on, and thank you for filling my brother and I's hockey knowledge gap on this one.
Much appreciated, guys. Anytime.
Thanks, Mike. We appreciate it. Why don't we move on, and maybe Andrew, you want to tell us about who's next?
Sure. Nick Mangold, born in 1984, passed away on October 25th. Mangold played his entire 11-year career as a center with the New York Jets. He was named to 7 Pro Bowls and 3 All-Pro teams during his years with the Jets.
So this is obviously a sad one because he was, younger than me. He was born in 1984 and passed away this year. His 7 Pro Bowls, I think, are second all time on the Jets. Yeah, second all time to another Hall of Famer, or another offensive lineman, I should say, a guy who's in the Hall of Fame, was Winston Hill, who was an offensive tackle on the Namath teams, and then he's just above another Hall of Fame offensive lineman for the Jets, who's his immediate predecessor as Jets center, and that's Kevin Mawai. So Mangold was kind of was there for a lot of eras. He started off in 2006, which was the first year of Eric Mangini. That was when Mangini was Mangenius, and they made the playoffs, lost to the Patriots, and then Mangini bottomed out the next couple of years, and then they brought in Rex Ryan, made a couple of conference championship games, and Rex eventually kind of sort of wears out his welcome, and then they have some struggle years. Rex eventually gets fired, and then Todd Bowles at 10-6 in his first year. They missed the playoffs, but they kind of recover a little bit. They're back to a degree of prominence, and that is Nick Mangold's very last year. He makes the Pro Bowl in his very last season. It actually wasn't his last season. It was second to last season, but he was there for a lot of different Jet coaches and some pretty decent Jet teams. I mean, 2 conference championships in a row.
Yeah, his best years were that 3-year run where the Jets were really good from 2009 to 2011. He was a first-team All-Pro in 2009 and 2010. He was second team in 2011, he got a big contract somewhere in there, and that was took him through most of the rest of his career. One of the things I'll say, I mean, it's interesting. He took over for Kevin Mawai, who was, this really decorated Jets center, all kinds of Pro Bowls and awards. Mangold took right over, and so if you think about it, 20 years or close to 20 years, maybe more than 20 years, the Jets had like elite level play at center from one guy to another. Now the pressure, at least externally from the media, for taking over at center is a little different than quarterback or, receiver or, something defense, edge rusher, something people pay a lot of attention to. Got even kicker if you think about it. But from a team building standpoint, equally as important. And, center was what I played growing up through high school. So I always appreciate really good centers. I could not stand those Rex Ryan teams.
Well, you couldn't stand Rex Ryan.
But there was a lot of guys on that team I couldn't stand. I've been very candid about that. It was right as I moved back to New York for a few years. And in addition to Rex Ryan, there was a lot of guys on the team, Bart Scott and Santonio Holmes, and then later Plexico Burris, and just guys I really just did not have a lot of time for. But Mangold was always a guy you had to go like, yeah, he's really good. And he's, seems like kind of a fun guy and would be in commercials locally and stuff like that. And, had the big beard. But, was the anchor of, and the thing people, you got to remember, especially about the first really good Jet team in 2009, but even the next couple of years, they had Mark Sanchez, who was a young quarterback. They were in an era of really, pass. It's still the era we're still in, really, in terms of passing. They were still a run-heavy team, a ground-and team. So you needed good interior line play, and he was the anchor of that team for years. And until 2016, maybe his last year, he played in pretty much every game. He might have missed one or two games total.
Yeah. There's a lot of 16s there, and then there's a couple of 15s and 14s. Yeah, and he was not injury prone. He did not miss a lot of games. He was very dependent for them.
Yeah, in 2016, it said he got hurt in week 7, came back in week 13, got hurt again, and then they put him on IR, and that was pretty much it. He got released, didn't officially retire till, the spring of 2018, but, never got close to signing anywhere again. So yeah, just a guy who, came out of college with a pretty good reputation, had been on the national championship Ohio State team in 2002, was the 29th overall pick. So late in the first round, which for an interior lineman, a center is, pretty rare. Usually the only offensive linemen who get picked in the first round tend to be offensive tackles because they want to protect the quarterback. But yeah, a guy who 11 years in the league, one team, just a continuous, even after his all Pro Bowl years in 2011 were behind him, still a really good player, borderline Pro Bowl level player. One of the, it's hard to imagine, it's hard to think of, he's got to be the best Jet in a very, very long time who only played for the Jets. Mawai, probably since Mawai. Because who else?
Mawai was on different teams. Mawai was in Tennessee and Seattle.
I mean, I don't know how far back you have to go to find a guy who's only ever played for the Jets.
But was Klecko only a Jet?
Possibly.
Yeah, and that's the 80s, but yeah, and I mean, even you think about it, Namath was not just a Jet. Don Maynard was not just a Jet. I don't know about Winston Hill, whether he was just a Jet or whether he was other places too. I can look that up real quick.
That era of the Jets, it was only about 3 years, and they only made the playoffs twice. And I could give my thoughts on that quote unquote era of the Jets being a little bit, overvalued in the history of whatever. But like the best guys, I mean, Darrelle Revis was the best player on that team, but then on the offensive side of the ball, it was probably Nick Mangold. Mark Sanchez was a good young quarterback, and they had a few guys like Santonio Holmes, and I think the first team had Thomas Jones on it, but like Mangold was the best offensive player on the last run of good football out of the Jets.
And Klecko did play with the Colts in the last year of his career, and Winston Hill played with the Rams in the last year of his career. Obviously, Revis was a bunch of places. Namath went to the Rams also. So, yeah, there's not a lot of guys who were just Jets. You compare that, and we hate to do this, but you compare that to the Giants when you got Sims, you got Taylor, you got Frank Gifford, you got Eli, you got, Harry Carson. There's plenty of guys with the Giants who fit into that rubric. So, yeah, so he's definitely, he's rare as a guy who spent his whole career with the Jets.
And just to close, because, I mean, you hate to do this, but anytime a guy dies young, you kind of want to go, well, he had been suffering from chronic kidney disease as far back as 2006, which would have been right when he came into the NFL. So he had kind of been private about it, but revealed shortly before his death this past October that he was had been suffering with this, and I think he was hoping for a kidney donation to maybe be to help save his life, but 10 or 11 days after he kind of went public with this, he was dead on October 25th at just 41 years old.
I think he'll get into the Hall of Fame at some point. It's really hard to quantify offensive linemen, but I do think he'll get in at some point. The other thing is apparently he was a huge Rangers fan. We were talking about Rangers hockey a few minutes ago because one of the things I found was several pictures of him in his Rangers jersey, full beard, heckling the other team's coaches from right behind the bench, which I thought was kind of funny. All right. Well, why don't we move on here, and we are going to talk about Paul Tagliabue, who was born in 1940 and died on November 9th. Tagliabue served as NFL commissioner for 17 years from 1989 until 2006. During this time, he saw the league expand from 28 to its current 32 teams. He was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2021. I was surprised. I mean, I wasn't surprised because the guy was 80 years old, but I was surprised because I actually just, I think it was earlier this year, or is it earlier this year or late last year, I actually went to a something at the Smithsonian. It was a panel, and it was like Darryl Green was there, and Tagliabue, and I forget who else was there, but he was there, and he did not seem like he was somebody who was, but again, he was obviously up there in age. I guess you got to consider him kind of like a caretaker commissioner. I mean, Pete Rozelle might be the most important commissioner in sports history. To me, it's probably three, right? It's probably Stern, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and Rozelle in some order. And then Goodell has sort of garnered a lot of attention, both for good and evil, or good and bad. I don't say evil, but Tagliabue, I don't know. There are things that are noteworthy about him, but it doesn't seem like he really left a huge mark as commissioner the way some of these commissioners have, and certainly not the way his predecessor did.
I guess that's fair. I guess the thing that I would say with Tagliabue, a couple of things. One, and I'm sure players' unions and the players, from that era would not be over the moon about this, but the thing you have to remember is this whole time there was labor peace. There was no strike. There was no really ending strike. The NFL had two mid-season strikes in 1982 and 1987, which wiped out big parts of the season. Since then, in 2011, there was a lockout that went into the preseason, but they solved it really just in time before it started to become a problem for the season. He navigated that. I guess I would say from a top line, Pete Rozelle is the guy who shepherded in the NFL as being the most popular professional sport in the country, or being the most popular sport in the country. Under Tagliabue's watch, they left everyone else in the dust to the point where they're not going to be approached, let alone passed anytime soon. If you think about how popular the NBA was in the 90s with Michael Jordan, the NFL was still the NFL. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There was other things that happened, but none of it came at the expense of the NFL, I guess is what I would say there. You had some new expansion, most of which has gone well. Carolina, Jacksonville. I think you could also say that he helped in the fact that two cities that lost teams got teams back in relatively short order.
Houston and Cleveland.
Baltimore, whether you want to consider it expansion or, I think, I don't know if enough people focus on this. Baltimore becoming an NFL, like the Ravens franchise has really that's been an overwhelming success for the 30 years they've been back in the NFL. Mm-hmm. Not just in terms of championships, but in terms of being competitive every year, in terms of rivalries, in terms of, I don't think they're one of the preeminent franchises in terms of marketability, like the Steelers, like the Cowboys, the 49ers, the Packers. But in terms of just being there every year and being a damn good team and having a rabid fan base, and you would know a little better than me, but like in that part of the country, they're as firmly established within their market as teams that have been there for 100 years.
Well, that was what I was about to say, is that there's not a chance that they're going to leave. You'll see the Orioles leave before you see the Ravens leave.
Yeah. He also, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's also, and again, who knows how much of this he was involved in, but stuff like Sunday Ticket, which was a huge boon to the league, the popularity of the league. That happened while he was the owner, and some of that was technology made it possible. I mean, I don't think any amount of Pete Rozell's forethought would have made it, happen in 1979. But that was a big thing. The NFL Network was a huge driver for, for the league. There is a sort of knock on him that we have to get to in a minute. But, I think, like you said, I don't know if he broke new ground, but a steady hand just on an upward trajectory for the success of the league and for the, for labor peace and all of that. I think you have to really hand it to him for that over a, nearly 20-year period.
Yeah, I think a couple things. First of all, I think he was somebody who I never felt like Goodell, and maybe I'm just getting older or whatever, but I don't know. I feel like the NFL and Goodell sometimes wants to take us all by our ankles and shake us until every possible nickel falls out, games on 9 different channels and games in Europe and every other place. And look, it's a business. I understand that. And maybe, like you said, some of the technology. I never got the feeling that Tagliabue was a guy who did not care at all about the sports part of it and only cared about reaping every last cent from the fans. And maybe that's just not fair, but I always thought that Tagliabue had a little bit more measured sort of understanding that in addition to being a business, it was also a sport and that the well-being of the existing fans matter. So that was one thing. I also think that he probably deserves a lot of credit. And again, it was thrust upon him, but one of the key times, maybe the key time of his time as commissioner was when the games were played in the wake of the September 11th attacks. And he had to make the decision about, when to come back, when not to play. They didn't play that first weekend. And so kind of some of those decisions that he had to make. I think even he himself would always say that figuring out how to navigate those games, those weeks in the wake of September 11th was probably the most important set of decisions that he made as commissioner. So yeah, there's not a lot to sort of laud him for, but I don't think there's a lot to sort of overtly criticize him for. And I think you can't say that about his successor. Now, let's sort of maybe take a step back. There's not a lot of sort of decisions that he made as commissioner that you can criticize him for, but I think there is one thing that you and I were both going to get to that is a part of his legacy that I think needs to be discussed. So I think we're thinking about the same thing. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I think you do have to consider that at this. By the way,
that's fair. That's fair.
He was also involved with shepherding the whole Saints situation in 2005.
That was the other thing. That was another sort of in the wake of a different type of tragedy in a different city. He basically told the Saints, you're not leaving New Orleans. Like, it is not going to happen. And so he deserves some credit for that, too.
So the one thing we would have to say, and again, we try not to use this as time to knock guys, but this was part of his official duty.
And let me just say one thing. It's hard when you're talking about an executive because these decisions are part of his official duties. You know, not that it was a good thing that Jim Brown or Bobby Hull was involved in domestic abuse or some of these other guys, but you could separate it from their sports career. With a commissioner, some of the negative is part and parcel to their sports legacy. So anyway, go ahead.
Especially as we talk about a bunch of other football players years before this, years after this, who die with brain damage.
Prematurely, yeah.
So he was not he was a bit of an impediment to any sort of progress or research or enlightenment on brain injuries as it comes to football. And I think we all can get it as a businessman. Like, he's in charge of a league. Like, I think all of these guys would have denied this until they got to the point when they couldn't deny it anymore. But we can't give credit for that. And, you know, specifically as early as 1994, he was at a panel at the New York City YMCA that also included David Stern and Gary Bettman. Moderated by David Halberstam. He's dismissed the increased fear as one of those packed journalism issues. He also said that the number of concussions is relatively small. The problem is the journalist issue. That same year, he established the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, ostensibly to study the effects of head trauma. Tagliabue appointed Elliot Pellman, a Guadalajara-educated rheumatologist with no expertise in head trauma. No results from the group were published until 2003. Returning to play after Pellman and his colleagues wrote in 2005 that returning to play after a concussion does not involve significant risk of a second injury either in the same game or during the season. There is no evidence of worsening injury or chronic cumulative effects of multiple MTBIs in NFL players. We know that now to be as wrong as saying cigarettes are harmless. So he does have to wear the era he was in charge of the NFL, the lack of anything about traumatic brain injuries. He does have to wear that.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think, I mean, you know, it's funny because as we're sitting here, just to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit, I'm watching clips from old wrestling matches on YouTube in the background here. And it's kind of like what happened with the WWF, WWE, where it was like when it became a good PR move to focus on the health of those involved, then all of a sudden everybody was always for it, and it was the greatest thing in the world, and this is something we need to be paying attention to. But like you said, they denied it until they couldn't possibly deny it any longer. I remember talking to a friend of mine in high school, and we were talking about the Giants, I think, and I think I said it like we were worried about somebody, and I was like, yeah, I think there was a fear that he was going to be really hurt, but I guess it's just a concussion. And I remember my friend Mike said, he goes, do you ever think that's kind of strange how like we use the phrase just a concussion when that's a bruise on your brain? And I was like, yeah, you know, I'd never thought of it that way, but that's a good point. And I think that's how we kind of all thought of it for a while. But yeah, I mean, look, it's, you know, here's what I'm going to say. certain guys are products of their time, but you can make that sort of part of the ledger. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, Kennesaw Mountain Landis wasn't the only guy who wanted to exclude blacks from baseball, but he was the commissioner. Similarly, Tagliabue probably wasn't the only guy dismissing the, seriousness of concussions and brain trauma. There were plenty of coaches and journalists and everybody else dismissing it too, but he was the commissioner and he had more power to do anything about it than anybody else. So, yeah, it absolutely has to go on his ledger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to mention that part of it when we're talking about that era.
Well, and also there's a little bit of an effort to obfuscate a little bit if you think about it. Like, all they had to do was appoint a qualified doctor to head that study, and they could have blunted some of those criticisms, but instead they appointed a rheumatologist. So, like, at a certain point, like, they were trying to be dismissive of the issue.
Yes.
All right. Well, we are moving right along, and we are back into the realm of basketball. Andrew, do you want to tell us who our next subject is?
Sure, Dan. Lenny Wilkens, born in 1937, passed away on November 9th. Wilkens was a 9-time All-Star as a player and was named to the NBA's 50th and 75th anniversary teams. As a coach, he led the 1979 Seattle Supersonics to the NBA title and is third all-time in wins behind Don Nelson and Greg Popovich. He is thrice inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame as a player, coach, and assistant coach on the 1992 Dream Team.
So earlier on here, you all heard us talk about Dave Parker, and we had Darren Hayes on from the Pigskin Dispatch, which was a little bit of a change in that, Darren is usually on to talk about a football player or multiple, and a little bit of the same here as we have George Bozica, who is the president of the PFRA, Pro Football Researchers Association, which you hear referenced quite often, and as well as a co-host of the PFRA Official Podcast with his son, John. So all of that being said, George, first of all, thanks for doing this again. You're one of our frequent contributors, so we appreciate you coming on again.
Sure. I always enjoy doing these.
So I think sort of the first thing, as we mentioned, as befits somebody who hosts a football history podcast and is the president of the PFRA, you're usually on to talk to us about football, but you asked to do Lenny Wilkens this year. So what is it about Lenny Wilkens that made you want to come on and talk about him?
Well, it was his years as Cavaliers coach in the 80s and 90s. Lenny was just a beloved figure in Northeast Ohio, during the time that he coached the Cavs. And, my wife and I were regulars at Cavs games during those years. And so Lenny always held a special place in my heart, and was really saddened to see that he passed away just a short time ago. So I thought it was, a tribute to him was really befitting because of, the love we have for him here in the area.
Yeah, and somebody who really kind of had a very sort of varied career. He played for 4 different teams, and then he coached 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I guess 7 different coaching stints, but with 6 different franchises. He was with Seattle twice, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But those are the years that I actually remember him the most, maybe and Seattle, maybe them and Atlanta right after he left Cleveland. But those Price, Nance, Doherty Cavalier teams were... For a very brief period of time, it was really kind of them, the Knicks, and the Bulls as the top 3 teams in the Eastern Conference. And in 92, which was the best, probably still my favorite Knick team of that era, the Bulls beat the Knicks in the NBA, the conference semis. And it was actually Cleveland with Lenny Wilkens as the coach that played the Bulls in the conference finals that year. So they were that good under him for a little while.
Yeah, no, they definitely were. He was there from 86 to 93, won 316 games, which the Cavs are just still a record for coaches for the Cavs. And you mentioned he had, Brad Daugherty, Mark Price, Larry Nance, he had Hot Rod Williams, Craig Elo, he made the playoffs 5 of the 7 seasons, but his big nemesis was Michael Jordan and the Bulls. The Bulls knocked them out of the playoffs, 4 times. I was there for the shot game, which, is one of the many, iconic bad moments in Cleveland history with the drive and the fumble and the shot. I was there and, it seemed to me that every time I went to a Cavs game, we normally would go see them play the Bulls and the top teams, the Lakers, the Celtics, back then. And, Jordan always played really well against the Cavs. I was at the Eastern Conference Finals the year that the Cavs and the Bulls played. It was game 6. It was 3-2. And the Cavs were actually ahead, as I recall. And then Jordan went on a tear at the end and put the Cavs away, 4-2. So, Lenny was just, a fantastic coach during that time frame. So respected, by the players, respected by the community. He was just a class act. And the interesting thing about that time frame is you would see these players and Coach Wilkens in the community. That wasn't unusual. If you were at the local mall, you would see them. If you were at a restaurant, you would see them. They were out and about. They were really down to earth, guys and coaches, and you would just see them around. You'd see them at the local pizza shop. I remember walking into a toy store one time buying Christmas gifts, and Mark Price was in the toy store. So, it was that sort of closeness to the community. And I think Wilkens was the one that sort of, thrived in that situation and was the role model for that team, because he was not only great on the court, he was also great in the community, with his foundation and everything else. Everybody that talked about him talked about, what a great, role model coach, and he did it quietly. I liked one quote from that said he was a quiet assassin on the court and coaching. So, he was an amazing person.
And if you kind of think about it, at least for me, from an outsider, talking about the city, the community, sports wise, obviously we know it's the Browns, but like Wilkens is there sort of as that Kosar late 80s run.
Right.
Starting to go down. The Indians are terrible and would continue to be terrible. And nobody knew, okay, in 1995, they're going to turn the corner. So
sure.
In the very late 80s, early 90s, ironically, when Bill Belichick was there in Cleveland,
right,
the Cavs were the best, team year in and year out in the area. So,
right,
you think of the Cavs as always being a distant third until LeBron James showed up.
Right.
But, during this era, it was sort of the golden age of the Cavs pre-LeBron.
Yeah, it was. They had the Miracle in Richfield season, but for that, this was when they really blossomed, as a franchise. And as you said, they were one of the best teams in the East during that era, you had, he started coaching in 86, obviously the Browns in 86 and 87 with Kosar. And then again in 80, I think it was 89, made it to the AFL finals and lost to Denver each time. But, the Cavs and the Browns were sort of the teams then, and then the Browns obviously tailed off. Obviously had Bud Carson as their coach. That didn't go well except for the one season. And, then we had as you said, the Belichick years, which ended with the Browns leaving town and then coming back. So, the Cavs were the team during that time frame with the Browns in the early part of that era. But, going into the early 90s, the Cavs were the team.
And you talked about that Miracle in Richfield team. I think that was 75, 76. He had actually been a player for Cleveland for a couple years before that in the kind of 72, 73 time period. His best years probably with St. Louis. He joined a team that had been a powerhouse in the Western Conference. They'd won a championship. They'd been to a couple finals, lost to Boston. This is Bob Pettit's team, basically. But then he goes to Seattle for a few years, and he's actually a player coach with Seattle, and then goes on to Cleveland, where he's actually not a player coach in Cleveland. It's a whole weird thing where he's kind of back and forth between playing, player coaching, and coaching for pretty much a decent chunk of the 70s. But he's a player, and that's actually his last All-Star appearance in Cleveland. So he's a decent enough player for them for a couple of years also.
Yeah, he was. He was. And he was sort of on the court, you could see why he was a player coach. I mean, he was sort of the consummate point guard. He was sort of, somebody referred to him as sort of a quarterback on the basketball court, because that's what he was. It was all about making everybody around him better. He was, smooth player, tenacious, good defender, had a good shot, always went to his left. And I thought it was interesting because Clyde Frazier said that you knew Lenny was going to go to his left. You knew it, and you couldn't stop him. He was just, that good on the basketball court. And that carried over into his coaching. He was quiet too. He was, I think one of the best, descriptions for somebody. And I think it's so worthy of him is he was a gentleman, and that's what everybody talked about. Is it just, I saw a tribute that Steve Kerr did, because Steve Kerr also played on those Cavs teams. Yep. And, and he found out during the press conference that Lenny died, and you could tell he was, really broken up, and just said what an amazing, good person he was. He was just a good man.
And Dan, now is a good time. That is Eddie to mention. You and I, he's got 1,300 and change wins all time, right? Mm-hmm. Dan, you and I saw what would be his second to last win. And I don't even know if you know this, but for that.
Was that when we went to the Knick game over Christmas that year, my senior year of college?
Yep. He was the coach 03-04 and then 04-05. And we saw them win. I'm looking it up. It was Wednesday, December 29th, 2004. They won to get to 16-13. They would win one more game. He would end up getting fired by the time they were 17-22. So, were it not for that one game, we would have Wilkens' last win of all time. But close enough, I guess.
Between Lenny Wilkens and Larry Brown, that was a great time period for the Knicks to bring in Hall of Fame coaches and then have to fire them. But, and then I guess the other thing that we should mention, well, two things actually. First of all, he actually leaves the Cavs in '93 after a bunch of playoff seasons at Georgia. I don't know if you know any of the details there. I couldn't find anything really meaty. I guess he just kind of thought it was time to move on and go to Atlanta. But he was weird, a perennial kind of 50-win team, and ends up leaving.
Yeah, he resigned and left Cleveland. I guess he felt that he had done what he could, and you're right. Then he ended up going to Atlanta and having some good years there. Dominique Wilkins spoke really, really highly of him, as a coach. He loved playing for him. So, and I like one thing that he said. He said he could coach you without saying a word. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I thought that was just a great quote that Dominique said about him, that, he knew his team. He knew, when to say something, when he didn't have to say something, and he got his message across. And I think it's amazing too. You mentioned it earlier that he's in the Hall of Fame 3 times. Mm-hmm. He's as a player, as a coach, and then he was an assistant coach on the Dream Team. Of course, that team won a gold, and then he was the head coach of the Olympic team a few years later, and also won a gold as the head coach of the Olympic team. So, but he was on obviously that Dream Team staff that Chuck Daly put together. So, he has that feather in his cap too.
And we should just also mention, the importance to Seattle. He's the godfather of Seattle basketball. Was one thing I saw him called. He coached the '79 Sonics team. Back-to-back NBA Finals were the same two teams. It was the Bullets and Seattle, and the Bullets won in '78, and then Seattle won in '79, which was that franchise's last championship until this year. And also the last, and I want to make sure I'm not saying this wrong. I don't think I'm missing anything, but the last major sports title in that city until the Seahawks against the Broncos in 2014. Yeah, because the Mariners certainly didn't win. So really important to Seattle, where he actually has 2 different tenures coaching. He's a player coach in the mid-'70s and then comes back as just the regular old coach in the late 70s. And that's the last NBA Finals before the Jordan Bird era begins. So it kind of gets lost to history a little bit. But Guy was an NBA champion as a coach with the Seattle Supersonics as well.
Yeah, and I remember those 2 back to back with Washington. I remember that distinctly, because that was a great team. Of course, I believe they were still the Bullets then, but I remember that was a great team with Wes Unseld and I think Alvin Hayes, and that was a great team. So I remember those back to backs, and then obviously, as you said, then you had Bird, Magic, sort of Jordan era starting in the the early 80s, and all those great finals with the Celtics and the Lakers, and then Jordan coming along obviously with his run.
So we want to thank you, George, for joining us as always here. But before we let you go, why don't you maybe tell the audience a little bit about the podcast you do for the Sports History Network, and then maybe more broadly what the Professional Football Researchers Association is.
Yeah, our podcast on the Sports History Network is the official PFRA podcast. I co-host it with my son John, who's a local broadcaster here in the Canton, Northeast Ohio area. He covers the Browns for Infinity Network and also Sirius Radio, and then also he works at a local station, covers all sports. He's covered the NBA Finals. He was at all 4 of the NBA Finals between the Cavs and the Warriors. So that's his background. And we've interviewed a number of football personalities, coaches, authors, players. We did an interview with Chris Willis recently, author and one of the archivists at the NFL Films, and we've been doing this now. This is our 3rd season with the podcast. And then PFRA, Professional Football Research Association, we've been in existence since 1979. We were founded at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Can visit our website. Just type in Pro Football Research Association and you'll find a link to our website. Most recently, we had our convention this past summer in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I think, Dan, you were there at the convention.
I sure was.
Yeah, Chuck Foreman was one of our guest speakers. We're really happy to have Chuck Foreman there. And we just came out with the 4th book in our Great Team series, too, on the 1964 Buffalo Bills. And we're working on the 5th edition of that on the 76 Raiders. That's going to be our 5th book in this series. And I always encourage people to join. We just recently raised our fees by a couple bucks for the first time in forever. It's $40 for members in the United States. You get 6 copies of our Coffin Corner, which, as part of the increase, we've also our first edition of the Coffin Corner in 2026 will be increased in size also. So you're getting more bang for your buck, plus the website and just everything else that's part of the membership. So I encourage anybody that loves pro football history to join the group.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been a member for, I guess, I don't know, since 2021. This is my 3rd convention last year, and I've gotten involved in some other stuff. I'm actually going to have my first Coffin Corner article next year. And
great.
We've gotten the DC Baltimore chapter kind of up and running a little bit. Yep. So it's really, it's for $40, you can't say enough about it. And the biannual every other year conventions are always a really great time. So can't say enough about the PFRA. So George, thanks so much for doing this and for some real insights into Lenny Wilkens as somebody who was there firsthand. So we really appreciate you joining as always.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Take care. All right. Well, we have 2 individuals left to talk about, and only one with just Andrew and myself. And is it my turn or yours?
I think it's my turn.
All right. Why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Michael Ray Richardson, born in 1955, died on November 11th. Richardson was named to 3 consecutive All-Star games as a member of the Knicks in the early 1980s, and was later included in the trade that brought Bernard King to New York. He struggled with substance abuse issues, but was able to win Comeback Player of the Year in 1985 or with the New Jersey Nets.
There's sort of, different eras of the Knicks, and there's the early years of the 50s when they went to 3 consecutive NBA finals, lost them all. And then there's obviously the glory days of the 60s or, of the early 70s where they made it to 3 NBA finals, won 2 of them. And then, obviously Andrew's in my era, which was when they were, they were in the playoffs every year, going deep, couple of finals, rivalry with the Bulls. And then right now, notwithstanding sort of the 25 years or so of darkness in the 21st century, there's sort of this weird time period in the late 70s and the early 80s of a team that I admittedly do not know a ton about, but Michael Ray Richardson was the star of the Knicks for 3 or 4 years, including making it to a couple of different playoffs, a very sort of underreported and underspoken about, including by us, time period in the history of the Knicks.
Yeah, it's a weird era both for the NBA and the Knicks. There's that. I think there's the one or 2 years in there where they wear blue and red instead of blue and orange in this time period.
And they got the names under the numbers on the jerseys.
Yes, yeah. So it's a very strange era. We've talked before sometimes about how like the '84 team is sort of under the radar because it was like before the Ewing era. This is even under that, whatever radar that is on, this is on, and somewhat unfairly, but also with some fairness too, Michael Ray Richardson becomes kind of the shorthand for talking about an era of basketball and an era of the Knicks that's associated with guys doing cocaine, because he did have a drug problem. He did end up getting suspended for life from basketball for it, that ultimately I think got rescinded after his playing career, his NBA career was over. But like you said, came up at 23 years old in the late 70s and was an all-star, 3 years in a row, 80, 81, 82. And then again was part of an influential trade for the Knicks.
This was an interesting thing because after Red Holzman retired, Red Holzman's last season was the 76-77 season, and the team had been kind of gradually going downhill for a while. By 77, you've only got a couple of guys left on the team from the glory years. In Red's last year, 76-77, Bill Bradley is playing his final season. Earl Monroe is going to be there for a couple more years. Phil Jackson is he's going to be there a couple more years as well, another year or two before he goes to the Nets. And then I believe 76-77 is the year they trade Clyde. Oh no, it's the following year. He's gone after the following year. So anyway, Holzman retires after the 77 season. He's replaced by Willis Reed, who has a decent enough season in his first year, makes the playoffs and gets the second round before they lose to Philly. 78-79, they bottom out 31-51, and then that's the year that Willis gets fired after about 15 games. Red Holzman comes back, and then in 79-80 is when 78-79 was Richardson's rookie year. And then they're mediocre in 7. But then in 1980-81, out of nowhere, they are a 50-win team, 50-32. And by this time, all remnants of the 70s team, the championship teams are gone. And this is Michael Ray Richardson. This is Mike Woodson, who later would coach the Knicks. This is a young Bill Cartwright, and then the two Williamses, Sly Williams and Ray Williams. This is a very Marvin Webster. This is a very different team that, at least for 1 year, is a good team. 52-30. You don't even really see them written about all that much because it just gets considered as part of the dark ages. But for a year or two, especially for 80-81, Richardson was the leader of a pretty good Knick team.
And then what is it? It's early, right before the 82-83 season starts that he's traded, or is it right as the season has already started?
He clashes with Holzman. He asks to be traded. He finally is traded about 2/3 of the way into the 82-83. No, that's more like half. I'm sorry. More like, it's at the end of the 81-82 season. He gets traded to Golden State for Bernard King, who was another guy who had had drug troubles in his career. King, luckily, fortunately, had turned it around by then and never really had any drug issues again during his playing career. But so in addition to what Richardson does, he ends up being the guy who's on the other half of the trade that brings Bernard King to the Knicks for a couple of years. And those were also some really exciting Knicks teams, at least for a couple of years.
Richardson goes to Golden State, not for super long, though. He's only there for 33 games and then gets traded. So it's the third team. He got traded in October of 82 from the Knicks to Golden State. And then in February of 83, he gets traded from Golden State back to the New York area to the Nets after just 33 games for Sleepy Floyd and Mickey Johnson. I guess the high watermark of him with the Nets would have been in 84 when they beat the Sixers, who had won the championship the year before, in the first round. He had 24 points in the game 5 back when those series were best 3 out of 5. They lose to Milwaukee in 6 games in the next round. This was the year the next year, 84-85, was when he won Comeback Player of the Year because the year before that, he had been suspended for he only played in 48 games in the 84 season because he was rehabilitating from substance abuse. And then in February of 86, his third positive test for cocaine, and David Stern bans him for life as part of the NBA's crackdown on recreational drug use.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, he goes and plays in Europe, I think, and then eventually the lifetime suspension is rescinded, but it's, he decides that he's not going to look to play in the NBA again. Yeah, I guess I would just want to, once again, kind of just like highlight a little bit this 80-81 Knicks team. It's not a team that I've talked about, and it's not a team that gets associated often with the history of the Knicks. It's almost like it's very different, it's the different uniforms. The Knicks have basically had the same uniforms, obviously, in this day and age. Everybody's got 37 variants of their uniform, but like you said, the blue and red with the names underneath the numbers, and I think also the fact that they in this first round 2 out of 3 series, they get swept by the Jerry Sloan coached Chicago Bulls team with Reggie Theus and Artis Gilmore and those types of guys. They get swept in 2 games, 90-80 at the Garden, and then they actually only lose by a point in Chicago. Overtime, actually. They lose an overtime game in Chicago in game 2. Who knows? Maybe if they had won that series against Chicago, things would have been a little different, whether it would have been then or just as far as the legacy is concerned. But, you talk about the 84 team with the Bernard King as this kind of one-off Knick team that was a good team before the Ewing era, but this is another one of those teams, and probably one that gets talked about even a lot less than the Bernard King team in 84.
Yeah, well, I think the fact that they got swept in the first round of the playoffs, it's hard 40 years later. It's not going to be a team that's on the tip of everybody's tongue.
And things go downhill quickly for Richardson and for the Knicks after this 81 season. He clashes with Halsman. He later clashes with UB Brown, which is what leads the next coach which is what leads to him getting traded. But just a note I had here from a book. In the 81 season, he earns first team all defensive honors, and he was one of only 2 players to average at least 15 points, 5 rebounds, and 7 assists per game. The other one that season was Larry Bird. So for at least a year or so, he was in good company, and the future looked somewhat bright.
And unfortunately, it didn't last long.
Yeah, although it's good he did end up turning his life around, and later in his life and stay away from the drugs. So at least on a personal level, it has a good ending.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving right along and coming down the home stretch a little bit. Andrew, do you want to tell us a little bit about Kenny Easley?
Sure. Kenny Easley, born in 1959, passed away on November 14th. Easley played 7 years in the NFL as a safety for the Seattle Seahawks. He was elected to the Pro Bowl 5 times and was named Defensive Player of the Year in 1984. Easley was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2017.
We are glad to have back with us a gentleman you heard from earlier in this end of the year special, Bob Swick, who is a colleague on the Sports History Network and co-hosts the Gridiron Great podcast, Gridiron Greats magazine podcast, and also edits and puts out the magazine of the same name, the long-standing Gridiron Greats magazine. Bob, we'd like to thank you again for being with us to talk a little bit about Kenny Easley.
Thanks for having me on. Kenny was a very, very interesting safety. He was one of a kind. Sadly, he got a bad kidney injury and he had kidney issues. He retired after 7 years of playing. He became very bitter about the game and bitter about the Seahawks. Things were made up back in 1997 when he was invited back to the Seahawks and things were smoothed over and he was inducted into their Ring of Honor Hall of Fame type of program there. He was an incredible safety. Number 45 for the Seahawks was just an amazing, amazing player in the 7 seasons that he played. I can only imagine if he played for more than 7 seasons what his numbers were. But think about this. He had 5 Pro Bowls. He had 3 All-Pros. And he played in 89 games. He ended up picking getting 3 touchdowns. He also had several sacks, and he had 32 interceptions in a 7-season period. And that's a lot for a safety, especially on a team like the Seahawks, who were, basically battling to stay above 500 several of those seasons. So he was really unique in how he played the game. He was very unique in his preparation for the game at the same time, because he went the extra mile. He was that type of player. He wanted to study who he was playing. He studied the quarterbacks. He studied who he was going up against. He was reading. He was a good reader of offenses coming off the line and in playing his position.
Looking at his obituary, I think this is actually from the Pro Football Hall of Fame site. There was a quote by Kellen Winslow, the Hall of Fame tight end, said that there are a lot of safeties who can cover but can't hit, and there are a lot of safeties that can hit but can't cover. And yep. Kenny Easley was a guy who could do both. And one of the other things I saw was that he tackles were not necessarily tracked as a stat as well in the late 70s, early 80s as they are now, but he was a guy who from the safety position had a lot of tackles in his day.
When he was able to read that offense coming at him, and he was not afraid to tackle a player coming at him to, stop the play, so on and so forth. You look at a lot of guys today as safeties, they'll do the quick knock or whatever, they'll get out of the way type of thing. They'll let somebody else try to tackle the guy. He took it on one-on-one. And that's a big, big difference as far as the way the position of the safety was played years ago, 40 plus years ago, as it's compared today.
Easley, you mentioned the sort of estrangement from the Seahawks, and I guess I didn't know a ton about this situation until studying for this podcast, that he was actually traded to the Cardinals after the 87 season, and he thought sort of as retaliation for being a figure in the players union during the strike of 1997, and I guess that's where the kidney issue was discovered, was with during the physical for the trade with Cardinals, that he discovered that he had this issue that ended his career.
Right, and he was blaming the Seahawks because he felt they overprescribed ibuprofen for his some of his ailments, so on and so forth. I can only imagine how much he took. I mean, if he was taking like 8-10 a day because of the pain or whatever, that will have an impact on your kidney. And sadly, it did play into his reasonings, A, to retire, and B, to be so mad at the Seahawks for that period of time. When Mr. Allen took over the Seahawks in 1997, he said to himself, well, we got to make good. This man was a Seattle Seahawk. He exemplified our defense. He was our number one safety for those 7 seasons. We got to get him back into the fold. And they did. And they did a nice job with that. And it took him a while, and he forgave them, and he became part of the Seahawks again. And I think he played a very big role in Seahawk history, which I think he resented, having that short career, so on and so forth. He did get into the Hall of Fame while he was still capable. He was still physically capable to be there at the ceremony, so on and so forth. So that was a good thing. I'm glad for him that he did. I've also heard the criticism, well, he only played 7 seasons. What's he doing in the Super Bowl? Well, you also got to take it a step further. What happened if this guy played 12 or 13 seasons? What would his numbers have been? But it would have been incredible. It really would have been incredible. So I think he really deserved being in the Hall of Fame, and I am happy for him. Sadly, that another gentleman who passed right around my age, who, he did get his reward with the Hall of Fame. He was able to see it, and he did make amends with the Seahawks, which I think is very important. Seahawks are a good organization. I mean, they're not, as much as they're a business, they are still a good organization. They still treat their players well.
Yeah, and I think he was probably part of the best Seahawk teams prior to the Matt Hasselbeck era, 2005. Right. Not that there was much to speak of, but they made a few playoff runs in the early 80s and things like that. So, him being one of the best players on, for the first 30 years of the franchise, it's a significant thing that they're able to, we're able to repair the relationship with him when Paul Allen took over.
Right. And I think I'm glad for him. That's what happened. And again, it's part of the game. You can get injured, you can get hurt, you can die from it, so on and so forth. And sadly, a lot of these guys, they gave everything out on the field, and they have health issues from it. What are we supposed to do? I mean, it is what it is, type of thing. But again, I'm glad he made amends, and his performance on the field spoke for itself. I can still visualize a number 45 for the Seahawks, and that's him making a tackle, making a pick six, whatever. And he's out there and he's playing for all he's worth.
Yeah, and in 3 of those 7 seasons, they did make the playoffs, including, I think it was 83, all the way to the AFC title game. Chuck Knox was the coach, and they had Steve Largent playing wide receiver, another Hall of Famer. And yeah, they made it all the way in 83, all the way to the conference championship against the Raiders when they lost, and that was the Raiders ended up going on to beat Washington in the Super Bowl. So yeah, one of the best players on a team that, at least for a few years, was a pretty serious contender in the AFC.
Right. And again, he's another one that, didn't get the chance to go to a Super Bowl, didn't get a chance for a Super Bowl ring or an AFC ring or an NFC ring. So, again, he was a great player in his time frame. Yes, he did deserve being in the Hall of Fame. And, sadly, he's passed. Another one of our legends of our game passes, but we can't forget him. That's what it comes to.
Absolutely, and that's a big reason why Andrew and I like to do this In Memoriam special every year, and Bob's been a part of it, talking about various NFL legends the last couple of years, and just wanted to thank him for coming on and joining us again. And remember to check out Gridiron Greats Magazine podcast, the Gridiron Greats Magazine. Go check it out, subscribe to the magazine, check out the podcast. Bob, thanks again for joining us this year.
And thank you for doing this every year. I appreciate it. And I know many former players and families watch this, and they're happy that their players and family members are remembered. Good job.
Absolutely. Take care, Bob. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks to Bob for talking to us about Kenny Easley. We didn't know at the time whether that would be the last subject of the year, but it turns out that Kenny Easley will, in fact, be our last commemorated individual on our 2025 in memoriam. So, Andrew, I think we had another good one this year, and it was nice. I feel like there were a lot more obscure-ish type guys who we maybe wouldn't have talked about, whether that was Michael Ray Richardson or, Fay Vincent, the former commissioner, Steve McMichael, Jerry Philbin, a lot of guys who, Kenny Easley, who you just heard about. A lot more guys this year who I think maybe are more under the radar types than we've had in previous years.
Yeah, and we didn't have a ton of guys who died young this year. Nick Mangold is the one that most jumps out. Maybe there's somebody I'm missing, but most of the guys at least lived some semblance of a full life. We also, like you mentioned, Easley was the last one we did, and he died in mid-November. So for the last 6 weeks or so, we didn't have anybody that we had to add to the list, which is, ultimately a good thing.
A good thing, yeah.
So you're right. It was a little bit of a lighter year in terms of total number of guys, but again, when you factor in what we're talking about, that's not a bad thing, and it's always a good opportunity to be able to dive into some guys and discuss the careers of different people who maybe if they were to get mentioned, they would be in passing, or just a brief mention on a larger topic. So it's nice that we can devote, a little bit of time to specific people in the year of their passing.
Well, this is the sixth one of these that we've done. This is the fifth full year of Hello Old Sports. We started back in October or so of 2020. I want to thank, and if I forget anybody, I'm going to apologize in advance. But we want to thank Andrew's friend Mike Petty for coming on and talking to us. We want to thank George Bazika. We want to thank Dana and Charles from Historically Speaking Sports. We want to thank Bob Swick, Darren Hayes, and I think that was everybody for this year. If I'm missing somebody, I apologize for that. But thanks to everybody from the Sports History Network and elsewhere who joined us, and thanks to you all for letting us do this, for listening to us, and for continuing to support the Hello Old Sports podcast.
Yeah, and we'll be back with normal episodes pretty soon in 2026, and when this time of year rolls around again next year, we'll I don't think it's not morbid to say, because obviously we're going to have some people, but we'll have a whole nother in memoriam for the year 2026.
Absolutely, and we will catch you soon with an back to normal programming, as Andrew said. But until then, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website, seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.